Can you feel me making you subscribe with the power of my mind? No? Clearly I don't have very much in the way of telepathy. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Today I want to talk to you about telepathy, telekinesis, psionics, all things related to those kinds of mental abilities that we group together as not quite magic. If you like this kind of world building content, please do hit the subscribe button down below. And if you want to be part of a community that talks about these world building elements, the link to my Discord server is down below as well. Okay, let's get cracking. So first, what do I define as these kinds of mental techniques? Well, DnD Psionics, not 5th edition, because 5th edition kind of is just magic, but DnD Psionics originally really felt like this kind of magic. It's the kind of magic that comes from inside you. It is all about your will. It's often also used in your more science fiction orientated or science fantasy kind of fantasy settings, where you're aiming to have a very hard magic system, but one that is also theoretically possible if humans were capable of manifesting these kinds of talents. Generally speaking, it is associated with one or two kinds of talents that a person manifests and that they can use at will using only what is inside them. It doesn't draw on an external power source, generally speaking. There is an exception, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to talk about one of the most iconic implementations of this kind of power-based ability, and that is the X-Men universe. In the X-Men universe, mutants have evolved these powers, these abilities. It's part of their genetic makeup. And this allows them to manifest things like fire starting or ice or, of course, telepathy from the Professor and from Jean Grey, super healing ability. All of these things come from inside them, from their mutation. The interesting thing here is that there is some elements of physicality that enters into it. So when Magneto, for example, puts on his metal helmet, he can keep Professor X from reading his mind, which brings an interesting element of the physical into this use of talent, because it's not a magical piece of equipment. It's not like he has put a piece of magic in place. He's put a physical barrier there that Charles Xavier can't push through, which is very interesting in terms of the limitation of these talents. And that is what makes these talents feel so different from magic. They are impacted by the real world. They are impacted by the physical world. Another thing that is interesting about the X-Men and that you often see in these kinds of worlds is that the physical attributes of the person wielding the talent does also sometimes matter. And often these kinds of talents are associated with martial arts and meditation-based lifestyles. So kind of Eastern warrior monks and those kinds of lifestyles, which is based around maintaining physicality as well as being contemplative and inward facing, is a lifestyle choice that often leads to these kinds of powers developing. You could argue that the Jedi and the Sith fall into that category. I don't know how I feel about the Force in this specific implementation. On the one hand, the Force is clearly a source of power. On the other hand, in world, the powers are described as mind powers, mental powers, abilities to harness the Force, sure, but it also is about what is inside you. And I think that the argument could be made that the Jedi and the Sith also implement this kind of mental abilities as a source of their power. What is interesting is if you do take that point of view, you now have two competing schools of thought on the topic, because the Jedi, of course, classically say that you must control your emotions. No fear, no pain, no love. You must act from a place of discipline. And this is important because that is where your power comes from. So it's that inward facing, meditative, always in control personality that then allows you to harness the force. On the other side, the Sith say, give in to your emotions, yield to your anger, harness your power. And that then allows you to access that kind of mental powers. So the philosophies are diametrically opposite, but the power that they bring to bear is the same, which is a very interesting setup for your world in terms of having competing philosophical schools around these kinds of mental attributes. But enough of that, I digress. Let's talk a little bit about DnD Psionics. So again, I'm not talking about 5th ed. In 5th ed, it really does just feel to me like another mage. But previously, psionics really felt different. You used crystals. You had this mana pool. You did everything from inside you. It wasn't a spell that you cast. It was an ability inside you. The soul knife and those kinds of classes very much felt like a psionic thing, like a thing that comes from the mind. And that association with crystals is quite often there with this kind of power source. I'm not entirely sure where crystals got associated with telepathy and talent and all of these kinds of attributes, but it definitely is classically there. So your crystal would be the thing that you focus with. You could have a knife made out of crystal that you infuse power into that allows you to wield this knife to more effectude. You can have magical items made from crystals. You can have additional power stored in crystals. All kinds of things that you can do with crystals. Now, why that's important is because it gives you a unique kind of element to work with in your world. It gives you a thing to make magical items with that looks very different from a steel weapon. You can even have smiths who are capable of blending crystal and steel to make a sword that doesn't just shatter on impact, that can actually take a few blows, but still has all of the inherent magical components of the crystal that allow it to channel the magic better. And that makes for a very interesting weapon and a very interesting special item and a very interesting special material. So that's DnD Psionics, and that we've spoken about the X-Men. But I said that there is a thing where you can really draw from an external power source. And here I want to talk about Anne McCaffrey's Talent series. So in the Talent series, you have people who are born with these abilities. Now, these abilities can be in telepathy or telekinesis. That's the two big ones. That's the big combo that allows the entire 9-star planetary alliance to function, because they are the guys who move ships instantaneously from one planet to the other. They're the guys who communicate across the vastness of space faster than the speed of light, and this allows the whole alliance to function. But there are also other kinds of talents. Medics, people who can heal others with their talents, and fire starters, and finders, and clairvoyants, and all those kinds of talents that we have said exists in our world that has now evolved to the point where they are scientifically provable. Now, there are two really interesting things that Anne McCaffrey did. The first is that she leaned into quantum science as the reason for why this works. So in one of the books, one of the telekinetics states that what he does is he observes the item to be in the location that he wants it to be, and then quantum energy transfers it there. Now, I am fully aware that a genuine quantum scientist would probably cut a million holes into that, but that's not entirely the point. It's science fantasy, not actual science. But the cool thing about that is it gives it such a unique little flavor to it that you have these people who utilize the quantum space as the source of their power. And they utilize the rules of quantum very loosely, obviously, in order to guide them in this activity. The other really interesting thing that Anne McCaffrey did was she did introduce an external power source, and it wasn't crystals or anything mystical like that. Instead, it was electricity. So these telepath and telekinetic guys, they can form what is called gestalt with a generator. They can lean into the power of that generator, and using the power evoked by its engine, they can increase their own ability dramatically. And it is that gestalt formation that allowed them to have the 9-star league, because without it, even the most powerful telepath and telekinetic combo could only reach within the planet. He couldn't reach beyond the sphere of the planet. But once Peter Ridinger was able to make gestalt connection, it became a limitless exercise, because you want to reach further, build a bigger generator. So that, I thought, was a very interesting take on telekinesis in a fantasy world and how to power it up using a more science fiction way of looking at it rather than a fantastical way of looking at it. And you can do this in a fantasy world as well, because you can evoke electricity not just from storms, but also from, say, a tidal pool. So you could have, water coming into a pool, and then as it runs out, it turns a mill, and this mill evokes kinetic energy, which is turned into electrical energy and allows a mage or a telepath or a telekinetic person or somebody with some of these psionic type powers to lean into that energy and do something truly spectacular. And then you don't need to have the science fiction-y elements. You can do this in a purely fantasy setting. So those are my thoughts on psionics and mental type abilities and what you can do with them and what has been done with them. If you like this video, please do hit the thumbs up button. And if you want to support me in making more of these, links to my book and my Ko-fi page down below. If you enjoyed this video, check out the other videos of my channel, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.